Now I'd like to introduce the Reverend Dr. Katie Day, the Charles A. Sharon Professor, Church and Society, who is also the Director of the Metropolitan Urban Concentration. Please.
Good morning, friends. It is so good to see so many of you and so many familiar faces, and even some metro urban graduates from our concentration that Dr. Krey and I got started in the early 90s and continues to prepare people for ministry in the urban context. So it's wonderful to see you all, and especially recent grads. As you know, being in churches right now and participating in our culture, you can see that there are great sea changes that are happening. There is the so-called rise of the nuns, that is the increasing numbers of young people who are saying they have no religious affiliation. There's also an increasing rise in faith-based organizations and social justice ministries, and some of those are represented in the house today too among our alumni. So there are a lot of changes going on, and it feels like we're at a momentous point in the history of the church as we think about new ways to be church, and not just in the 150-year-old granite buildings doing the same liturgies that are meaningful to us, but not so much to a rising generation. So the context is, I should have told you about my policy. Any of my former students can tell you my policy, and that is if your cell phone goes off during the convocation, you have to come and bring $1 here. And that dollar, some courses we actually make a lot of money. And if it's my cell phone, which also happens, it's $2. So this would be a good time to set your phasers on stun if you haven't done so already. Here come on down. Thank you so much. I haven't even thought of a policy if someone actually answers in class. So, but anyhow, set your phasers on stun. So in this time of change, this is a great time for people, for the alumni to gather and to, first of all, reflect on where we have been and what the trajectory, what our past legacy is, and what the trajectory of our future will be. And so we're going to have 3 outstanding presentations. The first resource person, who needs no introduction except that I do have some notes here, is President PhilKrey, whom you all know. And Dr. Krey is finishing up 15 years as president of this institution. He has, prior to that, he was with the little people on the faculty, one of us, and then he became dean, and then he has become president, and he has been a strong leader in changing times, and it hasn't always been easy. So we're delighted that as an historian and as a president, someone who knows this institution inside out, that you are going to be reflecting on the history and where we've been. So I asked Dr. Krey if he would, you all can read his bio in the in the program, but I asked him what he would really like me to say. And the first thing he said was that he loves this school, that he really loves the school. He loves the students, the faculty, the staff, the alums, the board, and he also equally loves the city of Philadelphia and this context, which is diverse and changing and has always been our context and a resource for our education. He is a proud graduate of UMass in Boston, of Gettysburg Seminary, he got his MA at Catholic University and his PhD at University of Chicago. And I believe you studied with Martin Marty, right? He has gotten a Fulbright fellowship to Munich and an endowment for the Humanities Fellowship as well that defined his academic career. And he has produced, besides being president of a seminary and a very busy in that capacity, he's also been on the side editing and writing a lot of academic books, including some are in the program, but for example, one that he co-wrote with Eric Keene on our faculty, a commentary on Hebrews, and another that he co-wrote with his brother Peter on Luther's spirituality. He loves to talk first. Let's be honest. He loves to talk. And he loves to talk about his decade in urban ministry in Baltimore. And that decade has been formative. And he continues to teach models of urban ministry in our program here and has continued to mentor generations of urban clergy and to serve in urban churches as well. He and his spouse, Renee, everybody knows Renee, but wave Renee, have been married for 40 years. They have 5 children, 5 outstanding children, all making remarkable contributions in different fields, and they have 5 grandchildren and 1 on the way. I mean, he's not keeping up with his parents' generation. They had some double-digit number of children. I mean, it was 16 or 17 children and 14,000 grandchildren. So, you know, they're kind of Abrahamic in scope. So he, by contrast, they've been pretty minimal with only 5 children. But anyhow, we are delighted to have Reverend Dr. PhilKrey, well known to you and just an outstanding historian, reflecting with us on our history, of which we've all been a part. So we are players in this story. President Krey.
Thank you, Dr. Day, my good friend. She told me when we talked about the 150th anniversary that you've been here for how much of it? Is it 50% or? 20%. She's the longest serving faculty member here at the seminary. So give her a round of applause. She has been formative in the changes that have occurred. Welcome. My assignment is the founding of the seminary and its history, but I'm going to have an eye to the renewal of the church. I don't think any of the other honorees are here yet. You're all honorees, but I see Raphael, and thanks for being here, and congratulations. And congratulations to the anniversary classes. So first I'm going to tell you what I'm going to say, and then I'll describe the outline that Dr. Day and I have put together for you. So the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia, or Lutheran, the Philadelphia Seminary, its commitment to urban ministry at the beginning was very short-lived after its founding. Its critics in Gettysburg argued that urban seminaries never thrive anyway. But in 25 years, the school left downtown Philly for a bucolic setting here in Mount Airy, an ideal of the middle of the 19th century. For landscape painting was very important then, and in some sense they thought they had made a mistake in going to downtown Philly. At its origins in the 1860s, this school made an enormous contribution to the confessional heritage of Lutherans in America, which we have honored and celebrated with 3 editions of the Book of Concord, the one by Timothy Wingert and Robert Culp being the last. And that has been such an achievement that Dion Lagerquist, who wrote an essay for the 130th anniversary of this school, says that no Lutheran seminary in this country would even dare to consider rejecting the confessions or to want to amend them or do something. That's the singular achievement of this school, that it won that argument hands down. In addition, the school addressed the new waves of immigrants to Philadelphia that shaped the seminary and the course of the Lutheran Church in America. Nevertheless, as far as I can see in the histories, and it may say more about the histories than it does actuality. I just want to say that right at the beginning, that the founders of this school seem to avoid the major issue of the day, namely slavery. So either Tappert, wanted to make no comments about it, or Dion Lagerquist, or many of the historians. Another one, Dale Johnson, wrote in 1966. They just don't mention it as an issue. Now, I'm a medievalist, and I was telling the dean this morning that the beauty of being a medievalist is that there's not much material, and it's all in Latin. Or the original languages. So if you read it, nobody knows what you're making up and what you're actually saying anyway. But in American church history, it's a lot of it's in English, and it's in journals. There's just, as my teacher Robert Grant said, there's just too much material. So I may have missed some things, Dr. Day, and I will submit myself to the Americanists like Dr. Kruger and Dr. Paul and others who may be able to come up with evidence to the contrary. We do know that Henry Melchior Muhlenberg and Pastorius were revolted by slavery in America. So when they came, they just found it absolutely repulsive. By the time you get to the 19th century, there are other accounts. The seminary has again returned to address its urban context and the major issues of the day. A theological education available to all races and denominations, issues of sexual identity, economic inequalities, public education, and gun violence. That does not mean that at its origin, theological factors and language, issues like German in the classroom, were not driven by context. A lot of the immigrants couldn't speak English, so German was important. Waves of immigrants were pouring into Philadelphia, and they were influenced by the Luther revival in the 19th century and the forced unification of the Reformed and the Lutheran traditions in Germany by Kaiser Frederick Wilhelm III. Many of the theological differences in the beginning were shared both in Gettysburg and Philadelphia, but faculty and leaders found it hard to live with diversity. Although always a challenge, we have learned as a school. We are a learning institution. We have learned to live with diversity with a sense of differentiated consensus, and I will define that term later. Translating the Christian message will always be part of the Christian mission. If Germans were flooding into Philadelphia and the Northeast, now those who speak Spanish and Asian languages provide a new context for which we have rich resources at this school. In addition, we need to translate the message and our rituals for the new generation of unchurched Americans. Finally, I will note that the early arguments are between generations in the founding of this seminary. Biel Schmucker, who inaugurated the new faculty in October of 1864, was Simon Samuel Schmucker's son. And many of the arguments were between generations, between uncles and nephews and fathers and sons. I think we have found better ways for generations to profess theologies and positions that bless each other rather than cause schism. Now, the historical accounts that I have used, and I'll begin this next section on the context, are, of course, Tappert's History, Dion Lagerquist's essay at the 130th anniversary. Dale Johnson wrote a wonderful essay for the Evangelical Review, and they have focused primarily on language, doctrine, liturgical practice over against revivalism and personalities. Then there's a major contribution, which the timeline has just come out. I don't know if Mary's here, Mary Brown, but the timeline has come out, and you'll be able to read the 125th anniversary essays by Dr. Lathrop, Dr. Eccles, Dr. Ruman, and very important contributions by Dr. Rohrbaugh and President Van Orsdal, which will be my theme, the public face of the seminary. Each of the issues address the context of the founding only marginally, as if except for language, theological factors, that somehow a seminary or a tradition can exist irrespective of the forces around them. Tappert's History, as you probably know, spends more time on personalities than it does on context. He does, however, do a good job showing that the Philadelphia Seminary's attention to the new German immigration and the need for pastors prepared in German, as we now need clergy prepared in Spanish, was indeed a part of the context. Without diminishing the enormous contribution of this school to internal debates about the confessions, liturgy, and practice, following the lead of Faith Rohrbaugh and President Van Orsdal, I would like to look at the public face of the seminary or the lack thereof in its history. So I'd like to look at the context, and then I'm going to yield to Dr. Day after each section. The first one is the context, and that is our origin from Gettysburg Seminary. And I've used for this material the new museum, which I commend to you at Gettysburg, and the fabulous exhibit in the Visitors Center at Gettysburg, the new Visitors Center, that shows the town after the battle, which is a new exhibit and just a stunning portrayal. So last year, the nation celebrated the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. There have been lots of exhibits and rediscoveries of what went on in Philadelphia and Gettysburg at the time. The Union League of Philadelphia, which of course was very, the Republicans were pro-Lincoln, right, and against slavery. In those days, the Democrats were pro-slavery, and not completely, but the parties were flipped at that time. And so the Union League has had two major exhibits on 1863 and on its founding in 1864, and I've used those shards, all those little things, to help put this picture together. After the battle, from July 1 to 4, 1863, Gettysburg was in ruins. The seminary itself was a hospital. The town had only 2,400 residents and had 7,000 dead persons on the battlefield. And there were far more persons in the hospital than anywhere else. The Schmucker House, do I have that? Yes. If you read that, Samuel Simon Schmucker was saying that the old dorm was all shot up, and his house was shot up as well. So imagine being a seminary in that situation where there were officers in the old dorm getting better while the students were there as well. In addition to that, in the summer of 1864, the year of our founding, there was a surprise incursion by a Confederate strike force in Frederick, Maryland, which was stalled, and soon thereafter an attack on Washington, D.C. So what I've learned from historians Maria Erling and others at Gettysburg is that Gettysburg was sitting in the fear of another invasion. It was, of course, not to happen, but they were afraid of that. And so in the summer of 1864, the Ministerium of Pennsylvania had already established a board for a new seminary, sought funding and endowments, and was seeking a location, perhaps in Allentown, but the ministerium had sent a professor, G.F. Schaefer, who was the Ministerium of Pennsylvania professor of German in Gettysburg, and he was to share his role with Gettysburg College, which he thought was much too much work. Now, the Gettysburg historians, Fred Wentz call him a malcontent, but that's, of course, from their perspective. But he suddenly decided to leave Gettysburg after he promised them in 1864 that he would stay. And that's at the same time when he said negotiations between the conservatives and the liberals at Gettysburg faculty were improving. So what's another important thing to realize in this history is that the argument was an argument at Gettysburg. It wasn't an argument that was just between Philadelphia and Gettysburg. There was an internal argument there that with the appointment then of Charles Philip Croth, was improving the situation. So there were two Ministerium of Pennsylvania professors at Gettysburg. And what prompted the founding of this school, as I have discovered, is that G.F. Schaefer decided to leave. After he promised he was going to stay, he decided to leave, to come to Philadelphia, took half the students with him, took all the German students and half the other students along with him. And they came then to Philadelphia. Now, I do want to just say one thing about this, and that is that there are no heroes in this story, because Samuel Simon Schmucker married a woman who I think eventually came to live here, who herself owned slaves. And he was an abolitionist, a liberal abolitionist, and one of the huge challenges of his career was that what does one do when one's spouse brings slaves who were in Virginia into the household? How does one deal with that? We came and established ourselves in Philadelphia, and it's important to realize at the same time that the churches are all dividing over slavery, as you can see. The Southern Lutherans separated in 1863, and we didn't come together until 1918. But the churches were all in crisis. But Philadelphia was not a haven, for those who were persons of color. Frederick Douglass said in 1862, just about the the nation as a whole. The relation between white and colored people of this country is the great paramount imperative and all-commanding question for this age and nation to solve. And later on, I'm going to quote him again, but I'll just say it now. He said there was no more prejudiced city in the country, other than perhaps New York, than Philadelphia. So a question I want to ask is that when in 1863, the Episcopal clergy of Philadelphia protested the biblical interpretation of Scripture that defended slavery, and here are all their signatures listed, there was no such thing that I can find, or at least that exhibits would put out, for the Lutherans. That wanting to be a church along this mainstream, or acting like being an immigrant church, right? We didn't feel confident enough to protest a biblical interpretation of slavery that the Episcopalians and the Methodists thought was important to protest. As other voices in our history were to come about, and so I'll turn this, O. Fred Nolde on human rights, Katie Day on Germantown, Dr. Day on Germantown Avenue and gun violence, Dr. Robinson, who's on our faculty now, who wrote our understanding of public theology, Dr. John Paul on violence, Dr. Timothy Wengert, who took the confessions and the scriptures to find a new interpretation on human sexuality. So use the tradition to turn the tradition to justice. We have learned as a school that we cannot hide behind the walls of the seminary, which one of our students, and that's I've used as well, Dustin Wright's paper, we built the wall. I always thought we inherited it from the Gowans, but the seminary itself built the wall. So we can't hide behind the walls of the seminary and insist upon liturgical or theological correctness while ignoring the challenging issues of the day. It's possible to be confessional and socially and politically and economically responsible at the same time. It is, in fact, appropriate and more challenging 150 years later to claim that the confessional heritage and to claim our confessional heritage and to champion public theology. The Ministerium of Pennsylvania objected to the entrance of the Frankian Synod to the General Council, or the General Synod, I should say, on confessional grounds, even though a compromise was being worked out, but the Frankian Synod had an abolitionist platform. We ignored the abolitionist platform for a theological argument, even though a compromise was being worked out theologically. And I already noted that there are no heroes in this because Schmucker himself, who would have welcomed the Frankian Synod, had slaves in his own family. But Philadelphia and the nation were growing very rapidly in the 19th century. Philadelphia was just experiencing energy, industry, and growth. But as a north of the Mason-Dixon line city, it was both northern and southern. Protestant, Lutheran, and Catholic immigrants were coming in droves. Blacks and Southerners all lived together. There were 20,000 freed blacks in Philadelphia at the time of the seminary's founding. But Philadelphia was sharply divided, just like the nation. When the Emancipation Proclamation was delivered, the mayor of Philadelphia did not dare mention it in his speech. And when the Emancipation was announced, African Americans the freed blacks had to hide in their homes or in their churches. They could not come out on that day. So again, Frederick Douglass said, there's not perhaps anywhere to be found a city in which prejudice against color is more rampant than in Philadelphia. Now, at the same time, I'm about to take my seat, Dr. Day, Grant was tearing up the South. So the war was not coming to an end, but indeed the war was progressing rapidly against the South, and the seminary decided in 1864 to come into the city, and here's where I'll conclude. That fall in October, the seminary established itself in downtown Philadelphia, where Theodore Schmauk, the board chair, said it gave easy access to all the advantages of bookstores, libraries, lectures, collections of art, and diverse churches and preachers of the city, not to speak of other educational institutions.
If you ever get to the 4-day Gettysburg tour that Elder Hostel, now called Rhodes Scholar, does, it's wonderful. It's a terrific trip. I don't know the new museum at the seminary. One thing I'm curious about, according to the people who are doing the tour out there, the Confederates destroyed Schmucker's home, too. They went to his library. They just, according to what I heard, ravished everything because of his abolitionist leanings, because of what he had written, because of what he had done in the anti-slavery movement. I did not hear anything about Mrs. Schmucker, so it puzzles me a little. Did the South know that? Did they not know about it either? And, was it his home that they destroyed his library in, or was the library in the seminary building, et cetera?
Good question.
So it's a really good question. They also, the seminary presidents had our annual retreat with Bishop Eaton in Gettysburg, and they took his Bible and threw it in the mud. And one of the Confederate soldiers wrote in it, and retrieved it, took it out of the mud, and rescued it, from destruction. So there's lots of history that's going on. I don't think until this museum was set up, and I commend your going to it. It's religious history at the time of the Civil War on the Gettysburg Seminary campus that's been put together by the National Park Service and others. But I don't think people even knew that the second Mrs. Schmucker owned slaves, because I was there with another guest who was outraged. She just read the end of that, and she just said, "I didn't know that. That is so awful. That is so terrible." And so that's why it's important to do history.
Yet his barn on the property was a station on the Underground Railroad, and that's brought out too in the new museum, which I commend. Also, I am a founder of that museum, and
Right.
It's a wonderful exhibit, and as you say, brings in much of the history of religion during that period of time.
So he just didn't know what to do with what his second marriage brought into his relationship. He writes about it. He was extremely conflicted about the fact that his wife's family owned slaves.
Just to hear you speak about the major accomplishments of the seminary being the Book of Concord, 3 publications of it, great academic and intellectual work, and the fact that we built the wall. It almost, if you just gloss over everything you said, which is what I'm doing, there's a price to be paid for becoming personally associated with, for example, slavery and non-slavery and so on. Maybe there's an isolationist kind of approach to the establishment of this seminary? Like, let's get out of the way and concentrate on theology. Not that it shouldn't be applied.
You summarized my whole lecture.
Oh, sorry.
One of the key issues in the Donatist controversy was for many, many years, people argued it from its theological perspectives and never looked at the other factors that were around that great 4th century conflict that Augustine was part of. And so my only point is that you have to look at all the factors. If you just look at the theological factors, you're missing at least 75% of the story.
I found in ministering in Maryland German and Pennsylvania German parishes, it was difficult to find out when they left using the German language and went to the English language exclusively in their services. Or do you mean by saying there was a German emphasis, that there was an emphasis on ministering to people who were immigrants from Germany, or to rural churches of born in America people who worshiped in German?
It's so wonderful that you make that point, because at Gettysburg Seminary in the environs, there were no German speakers left. It was all English. And Philadelphia was experiencing a massive wave of new German immigrants who were fleeing, for economic reasons, the failed revolution of 1848. I mean, you could go on and on, right? I'm a medievalist. I don't know much about those things, but there were lots of dynamics going on that drove immigrants here. Who had many of the leaders had experienced the Luther revival as well. So yes, there was a huge German influx here, and then of course many of them jumped, over to Missouri, et cetera, too. So there was an expanse. But Gettysburg was emphasizing English, and its environs were emphasizing English. They wanted to be an American Lutheran church. And the same thing was happening in the Roman Catholic experience as well. There was a famous Roman Catholic bishop who wanted the Catholic Church to be an American Catholic Church, and the Irish immigration overwhelmed that. So that changed the Roman Catholic Church in this country as well.
Yeah, we're going to have to move on, but last question.
Just occurred to me as you were speaking about the German immigration, yes, a lot of it was, I think, fueled by economic concerns, but I think also, and this relates to some of my own family history, there were a lot of people that were escaping Germany because they didn't want to be drafted into military service. And I wonder if some of that immigrant population coming into Philadelphia or having been settled in Philadelphia around the time of the Civil War didn't want to be dealing with the question of whether or not they might be pressed in military service here. Was anybody written anything about that part of this, and the sense that perhaps a sense of a Lutheran church that was not so engaged in promoting any kind of war would be very appealing? I don't know.
I don't know an answer to that, but that's very helpful. I do know that my dad immigrated here after World War I, served 2 German parishes, and his experience of Germans at that time is they wanted to be German. They didn't want to be religious at all. I mean, so there was a kind of, and they had all fled. They had all fled the draft in some way. He had a very difficult time, being a pastor of German congregations that wanted to be culturally German. They didn't want to, actually be Lutheran. So my second section, and they get briefer as I go along, because I know less and less as we move along. So the second section is called Leaving the City for the Country and Its Consequences, Coming to Mount Airy, Trying to be American Lutherans Alongside the Mainstream. And that's a Martin Marty term, the last part. Wanting to serve as a retreat from the temptations of the city and to become a self-sustainable community. And I saw Dustin come in, right? Dustin Wright has written a magnificent paper, on the seminary's founding. So give him a round of applause. He's one of our students. So in other words, to be self-sustaining, almost like a sports stadium in our modern cities that want to provide all kinds of things for the community, but they're self-sustainable and oftentimes don't accomplish that. The seminary moved out to the countryside in 1888-89. And I always thought, until I read Dustin's paper, you weren't here yet when I gave you credit for that, Dustin, that we inherited the wall from the Gowan estate. Not true. The seminary built the wall. It was built to create an academic and spiritual barrier with the outside world. And it was so effective that until recently, few people in Philadelphia even knew that there was a seminary here. In Canon Nurser's book on Ofred Nolde, he writes that was deliberate, that was intentional, to hide away. In a missional age, we have now deliberately become self-insufficient. A self-insufficient community with porous boundaries and spiritual and communal and academic axes. Let's see if I can find it. This sort of is the quadrant now. The Great Wall in front of the chapel has been opened to a plaza. And this was all designed by George Yu, who designed our master plan. So that students who prepare here recognize that worship is public and needs to be inviting and inclusive and not a mystery rite. The assembly is no less than where the word is rightly proclaimed and the sacraments rightly administered, but with the whole city and nation and world in front of us, it is so much more. The stay in the city was short-lived, 25 years. The seminary was downtown, but the city caught up with the seminary again. And despite opportunities in the 1960s, the Wiedemann brothers, as you all know, right, offered the land where the Plymouth Meeting Mall is now located to the seminary to move out to the suburbs. And our wise leaders said no, and built the Wiedemann Center instead. And they also renovated the campus and stayed. And after $40 million of investment here, we can't afford to leave anymore. It did not take long, however, that the student population, was growing, and now this is back in downtown Philadelphia, and the students forced that they build downtown, so we built downtown too, enough for about 60 more students. But the students objected to the mandatory meal plan and caused it to fail by refusing to eat. And some things never change, because they said they could eat better and cheaper in the local restaurants and bars than in the meal plan in downtown Philadelphia. And the faculty actually had curfews, et cetera, and some of the biggest board discussions were over their finding students in bars at night after the hours when they were supposed to report. So the same crowded downtown, with all its resources that Schmauk had advertised, and its temptations, like the theater, prompted it to look for a location outside the city, even though it made, according to the board chair, the aid of pastors and others in instruction more difficult. So it moved out here, even though they knew that theological education, the pedagogy, would be more difficult. Again, the board chair. It was wiser to woo wisdom in her own ideal home on Mount Airy, where at sundown the student nestles in deep silence of an upper this is serious, of an upper alcove in the library in soul companionship with the spirits of the dead. There's no doubt that study requires leisure, peace, security, and safety. But without challenge and context, the learning can be irrelevant to the challenge of the gospel today. Do I need to read that again? You know, it's important for an academic community to be safe, for faculty to have, and I mean this in a constructive sense, to have the leisure to read and prepare, you know, and to be able to teach. But without the challenge of context, all that learning can be irrelevant. As one reads the histories, it's important to see the care and concern that the ministerium in adjacent states had for the faculty and the seminarians. I'm a president, after all. They were accountable for financial support and feared lest they lose their governance by not supporting the school. There are regular dialogues between the adjacent states and this seminary about whether certain states were allowed a trustee because they weren't able to support a faculty member. They usually endowed faculty positions. John Van Orsdal, in his introduction to the 125th celebration edition, says the Philadelphia Seminary fled to the suburbs to escape the changing neighborhood. Since then, however, to quote Dustin Wright, our student, the seminary has generally answered this question somewhere between viewing the campus predominantly through a monastic tradition of separation and a more missional model of engagement with the outside world. While notable exceptions, our campus has been on a pilgrimage across the spectrum, slowly shifting away from the weakness of the monastic model while striving to retain the sacred character of its place and community. End of quote. It's important to know that Dustin has learned his history well. The classic Benedictine model valued self-sufficiency, that monastic model, over and against a hostile world. He commends, and again I quote him, the model of Dominic, the Dominicans, and the Franciscans, like our current Pope, who saw the world as their monastery. So in other words, not to withdraw, but saw the world as their place of mission. We have planned a campus, as I said before, that is deliberately not self-sufficient. To quote John Van Orsdal, again 25 years ago, the institution that I knew 40 years ago, so this is 40 years before the 125th anniversary, was a very solid place academically. So some of you alums who are back from that era can feel good about that. But I felt at that time that it had a rather narrow vision. The students formed a little island very closely tied to the church, but not very closely tied to the world. One of the striking things I find in coming back here now is the multitude of programs that reach out to the community, programs like the Urban Theological Institute. It seems to indicate a greater openness and exposure to the world, both in terms of service to pastors from other churches and to the people in the community. In Dustin Wright's paper, he quotes George Yu, and he actually interviewed me, and I was quoting George Yu, so this is a double quote, who worked out the theme of how this seminary could be in a community when he put his master plan together for the new campus in the early decade in the 2000s. That included this building that is now sort of the town hall for Mount Airy. And so this is George Yu's language, our architect's language. This should be a self-insufficient campus, meaning it should be interconnected with the surrounding environment and community. The seminary must reach out to the community rather than turning inward upon itself. In planning a modern city, neighborhood, or campus, we are continually confronted with the issues of the perimeter at the site, sometimes referred to as the boundary, border, or the limits. But in these modern times, one can think of an edge not as a barrier or as an obstacle, but rather as a seam, which means joining by stitching together these edges, joining these into one. I think it is appropriate for today's seminary and the body of the church to be without borders, embracing its people and neighbors. So that was the vision of our architect in putting the new campus together that you see here. What did not work for a campus can also not work for a church. The historical arguments generally assume that Lutherans can exist alongside the mainstream of American religious life and serve quietly through its excellent social service institutions and our congregational charities and liturgical rituals without being publicly involved. The problem is that we're not a sect. Did you hear that? We are not a sect. A church of 4 million that has its roots in the state churches of Europe, where the church learns from culture and context as well as from its tradition, cannot behave like a small sectarian church. I frequently teach my students Tracy's double method, David Tracy's double method of correlation, as opposed to Tillich's single method. You know, Paul Tillich taught us that the culture asks the question, the church responds by looking at its tradition and finds an answer appropriate to the question. David Tracy has said, no, it goes both ways. The culture also helps us to understand our tradition and informs our tradition. He has the double correlation method because God created this world as well as the church. So the great churches, you know, of the Reformation use a double method of correlation. We don't just simply look to our own traditions for the answer. I would argue that this is true of Christianity in general, although there is always a minority voice that needs to be heard. So that voice that sometimes is over against culture needs to be heard, because that's also part of our tradition. In the formation of the LCA and its mission to public church, we have joined the mainstream, even though there are still voices that call us to hide behind the walls and monastic aspirations, like we did here in the 1930s, when, again, Canon Nursa points out in his biography of Alfred Nolde, faculty commuted back and forth to Germany and never mentioned the rise of fascism there. Just ignored it. This has changed since the war, with Alfred Nolde, Jack White, Randy Jones, and on your tables, this is a PhilKrey bump, is our alum, Gladys Willis's book, Raise Your Hand, Gladys, if you want to read about her journey. Dr. Robinson, Dr. Day, Faith Rohrbaugh, Timothy Wengert, and the current faculty all, who are exceptional in advocating public theology. The founders of this school withdrew from the American Protestant mainstream to be a church alongside the mainstream. The challenge with each of the accounts is that they contrast what already then was called a Lutheranism identified with America and opposed to the Lutheranism that would remain European in its particularities and not set roots in American culture and history. As Martin Marty has said, Lutheranism in this perspective has wanted to be alongside American culture and not within it. It is a major denomination in the US now with 4 million people, and it can't behave anymore as an immigrant church. It is too diverse and complex. It can be confessional Lutheran and ecumenical, activist, and focused on worship. At LTSP, we have learned to live with multiple identities and be confident as a Lutheran seminary. Our founders resisted ecumenical alignments, but we have learned to be confidently Lutheran and ecumenical at the same time.